A cowboy risked everything for an elderly Apache woman, and the reward was incredible. Jack Colton had been riding through the desert for days. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. The dry, hot wind whipped through the sparse brush, carrying with it the scent of dust and earth. Jack, a cowboy by trade, was used to the harsh conditions of the West, but even he could feel the toll the journey was taking on him. His horse, a sturdy animal named Rusty, was growing tired, his hooves kicking up clouds of dirt with every step. Jack's own body ached, muscles sore from the long hours in the saddle, but there was no turning back. He had a destination in mind, and it was a place he needed to reach soon. The road ahead seemed endless, a never-ending stretch of sand and rock. There was no sign of life, no other travelers, just the isolation that defined much of the American West. Jack had learned to survive in these conditions, relying on his instincts and experience. He knew how to find water in the most unlikely places, how to navigate by the stars, and how to avoid the dangers that lurked in the wilderness. But even with all his knowledge, he had never been prepared for the sight that appeared before him that day. As he rounded a bend in the trail, Jack's eyes caught sight of something that stopped him in his tracks: a woman. At first he thought he was imagining it, but there she was, standing alone in the desert, her back hunched and her face turned downward. She seemed to be struggling, her movements slow and unsteady. Her horse, a small mare, lay collapsed on the ground, its body limp and lifeless. The woman looked weak, her clothes ragged and torn, as though she had been stranded for days in the unforgiving heat. Jack's first instinct was to ride on. He had learned long ago that getting involved in other people's troubles could lead to danger. The Apache people, in particular, were known for their fierce independence and hostility toward settlers. The last thing Jack wanted was to find himself caught up in a conflict he had no part in, but something about the woman's frailty stopped him. He could see that she was in desperate need of help, and for reasons he couldn't quite explain, Jack couldn't just leave her there to suffer. With a deep breath, Jack nudged Rusty forward, approaching the woman slowly. He kept his distance, his hand resting on the handle of his revolver, ready for anything. But as he got closer, he saw the deep lines of age on the woman's face, the weariness in her eyes. She was no threat to him, that much was clear. Her horse, though, was another story. It had collapsed, most likely from exhaustion, and now the woman was stranded without any means of travel. "Ma'am," Jack called out, his voice calm and steady. "You need help." The woman didn't respond right away. She looked up at him with tired eyes, her face shaded by the wide-brimmed hat she wore. Jack couldn't tell how old she was, but he guessed she was well past the age of being able to survive on her own in the desert. Her clothes were simple, brown, worn leather, the kind of attire that could belong to someone who had lived a hard life. "Please." The woman's voice was barely a whisper. She seemed too weak to speak any louder. "My horse, it's gone. I have nowhere to go." Jack's heart softened. He could see now that she wasn't dangerous. She was simply a woman in need of help, stranded in a harsh place with no one around to lend a hand. It wasn't the kind of situation Jack usually found himself in, but something told him that this time he couldn't just ride away. "Don't worry, ma'am," Jack said, his voice steady and reassuring. "I'll get you out of here." He dismounted from Rusty and approached the woman. She watched him warily, but Jack was careful not to make any sudden movements. He was still a stranger to her, and trust had to be earned. Slowly, Jack extended a hand to the woman, offering her a chance to climb onto his horse. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I can't ride," she said softly, shaking her head. "I'm too weak." Jack nodded, understanding. She was too frail to manage a horse on her own, especially after everything she must have gone through. But he wasn't going to leave her out here alone. There had to be another way. "Then I'll help you," he said simply. "Come on, we'll ride together." The woman hesitated, but eventually allowed Jack to help her up. She climbed onto Rusty behind him, her arms wrapped gently around his waist. Jack gave her a reassuring glance, and with a soft kick, Rusty began moving forward. The desert seemed endless, but Jack had a sense of purpose now. He wasn't just riding for himself anymore. He had someone to look after. As they traveled, Jack tried to strike up a conversation, though the woman seemed hesitant to speak. After a while, she began to relax, and Jack noticed the way she gazed around at the desert landscape with a sense of familiarity. She wasn't just lost. This was her home, or at least it had been. "You know this place well, don't you?" Jack asked. The woman nodded, her hand gripping his waist tighter. Yes, I was born here in the desert. My people have lived here for generations. Jack frowned slightly, unsure of what she meant. He had heard stories of the Apache and their fierce independence, but he knew little of their culture and history. He had always kept his distance, respecting their territory but never getting involved. Yet here he was, helping one of their own. My name is Jack, he said after a long pause. What's yours? Yana, she replied, her voice soft but clear. I'm Yana of the Apache. Jack's heart skipped a beat at the mention of her tribe. Iyana's name, however, carried a weight to it. She was no ordinary woman. She was a part of something much bigger than herself. Jack could sense that, and a part of him wondered how he had ended up in this situation. Why had he, of all people, decided to help her? Where are you headed? Jack asked, trying to keep the conversation going. Iyana paused, her breath shallow. I don't know. I was trying to make it to a village, but my horse gave out on me. I've been walking for days. My strength is gone. Jack didn't say anything. He simply focused on the trail ahead. He had a decision to make, and it wasn't one he could take lightly. Helping Iyana was risky. He knew that, but the way she spoke of her journey, the desperation in her voice, it made him feel like this was something he had to do. No one deserved to die out here alone. For the next few hours, the two of them traveled in silence. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert floor. The air cooled slightly, though it was still heavy with the dust of the land. Jack had no idea where he was going, but he didn't need to. He just needed to get Iyana to safety. He would figure out the rest later. And so, with the desert stretching endlessly around them, Jack rode on, the weight of the journey settling heavy on his shoulders. He had no idea what awaited him ahead, but one thing was certain. He would not turn back now. The sun began its slow descent as Jack and Iyana continued their journey across the vast desert. Jack kept his eyes on the horizon, the trail ahead stretching endlessly before him. Rusty, his horse, seemed to be moving a little slower now, but Jack wasn't concerned. The desert was unpredictable, and his focus remained on getting Iyana to safety. They had ridden in silence for the most part, only the soft sound of hooves on the dirt filling the air. Iyana, still weak from her ordeal, clung to Jack's back, her hands resting lightly on his waist. She seemed more relaxed now, though Jack could tell the fatigue still weighed heavily on her. Every now and then she would shift slightly, her breathing shallow but steady. As they rode, Jack noticed that Iyana's gaze never wavered from the landscape around them. The way she looked at the land with such quiet reverence made Jack wonder about the world she had known, the world she had left behind. He had always been a loner, a cowboy focused on his cattle and his work, but there was something about Iyana that piqued his curiosity. You've lived here your whole life, haven't you? Jack asked, breaking the silence. His voice was gentle, respectful of the fact that Iyana might not want to talk, but he felt the need to ask. Iyana nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the desert. Yes, I was born here, she replied softly. My people have lived in these lands for generations. The desert is both our home and our challenge. It's not a place for the weak, but for those who understand its ways. Jack didn't speak right away, letting her words sink in. He had heard stories of the Apache, of their strength and resilience. But hearing it from Iyana, in the quiet of the desert, made it all the more real. She wasn't just telling him about a way of life. She was sharing a part of herself, a part of a culture that had been both shaped by the land and shaped it in return. The land teaches us, Iyana continued, her voice distant as though she were speaking more to herself than to Jack. It tells us when to move, when to stay, when to fight, and when to walk away. The desert is alive in its own way. It does not forgive weakness, but it does not take everything. If you know how to listen, it will tell you everything you need to survive. Jack, though raised far from the desert, could hear the wisdom in her words. He had never thought much about the land like she did. For him, the desert had always been something to cross, something to conquer in order to reach his next destination. But Iyana had a deep connection to it, one he couldn't quite understand. He wondered what it must have been like to grow up here, surrounded by such an unforgiving yet beautiful landscape. He felt a sudden sense of responsibility. She wasn't just some stranger in need of help. She was someone who had lived through things he couldn't imagine. She had a story, a history, and Jack was becoming more and more curious to learn about it. Tell me more about your people, Jack said, his voice quiet but sincere. He didn't want to pry too much, but he couldn't ignore the pull to understand more of what Iyana had gone through. For a long time, there was no answer. Iana didn't seem to mind the silence. She only tightened her grip around Jack's waist, her fingers pressing into his leather jacket. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and almost wistful. "We were once many," she began. "Before the settlers came, before the soldiers arrived, we thrived in this land. My people knew the desert better than any, and we were proud of it. We fought hard for what we had, for our land, our culture, and our way of life." Jack could hear the emotion in her voice, but she kept her words measured, like she had told this story 1,000 times before. He wondered how many others had asked her to share it, or if she had ever spoken to anyone about her past at all. "But then things changed," she continued, her voice growing quieter. "The settlers came, bringing their laws, their ways, and their weapons. They took what they wanted, forced us from our land, and tried to make us into something we were not. The world around us shifted, and we had to fight to survive, but it was never enough. The desert was no longer a sanctuary, it became a battleground." Jack didn't know how to respond. He had heard stories about the conflicts between settlers and Native American tribes, but hearing it from Ayana, from someone who had lived through it, was different. It was real, raw, and painful. "What happened to your people?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yana's eyes clouded over as she looked ahead, her gaze fixed on the endless expanse of desert. "We lost much," she said. "Some of us were forced to move into reservations, others scattered. Some fought until they couldn't fight anymore. But there are still those of us who remain. We are the ones who remember, who carry the old stories and the old ways. And we will continue to live as we always have, even if it means we are few." Jack felt a deep sense of respect for Ayana's words, but it was also mixed with a pang of sadness. She had lost so much, her people scattered and broken, and yet she spoke with a quiet strength that made him admire her even more. She wasn't bitter or vengeful. She had accepted what had happened, but she hadn't allowed it to break her spirit. They continued to ride in silence for a while, the weight of her words hanging in the air between them. Jack couldn't help but think about his own life. He had grown up in a world of cattle and open ranges, where the biggest challenges were dealing with the weather and the occasional rustler. His life had never been as hard as Ayana's, and yet he had spent so much of it focused on himself. Helping her now was more than just a chance encounter. It was an opportunity to learn, to understand, and perhaps to make up for the things he had taken for granted. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert floor, Jack felt a sense of urgency rise within him. They needed to find shelter before the night set in. The desert could be deadly after dark, and they had already traveled far enough to make the night dangerous. "We'll make camp soon," Jack said, his voice breaking the silence. "I know a place just up ahead where we can rest for the night." Yana didn't respond immediately, but Jack could feel the weight of her presence behind him. She was still weak, but her mind was sharp, and her stories had revealed a side of the desert he had never known. He realized then that helping her was no longer just about getting her to safety. It was about something deeper, something he hadn't expected when he had first come across her. Jack urged Rusty forward, his thoughts still lingering on the words Ayana had shared. The desert might be harsh and unforgiving, but in its vastness, it had a strange way of revealing the truth. And as Jack looked out over the endless horizon, he realized that his journey with Ayana was only just beginning. The sun had long disappeared behind the jagged mountains, and the cool desert night was settling in. The sky above, dotted with countless stars, was a stark contrast to the barren land below. Jack, still guiding Rusty through the shifting sands, had been searching for a place to make camp for hours. He could feel the tension building in the air, a heavy silence hanging between him and Ayana. For the most part, they had traveled in peace, but something was different now. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that danger was lurking in the distance, something he couldn't quite place. It was the kind of instinct that a cowboy learned to trust over time, the sense that something was wrong, even if the world around him looked calm and still. Iana, who had been quiet for the past few hours, shifted slightly behind him on the horse. Jack could feel her restlessness, too. He glanced back over his shoulder to check on her. Her face was shadowed by the wide brim of her hat, but her eyes glinted in the starlight, scanning the dark desert landscape. She seemed to be on edge, just like him. "You okay?" Jack asked, his voice soft but filled with concern. Iana didn't answer immediately. Her hand tightened slightly on his waist, as if she were holding on to the last bit of strength she had left. For a moment she said nothing, lost in her thoughts. Jack didn't press her. He knew better than to rush someone's words, especially when they were unsure or frightened. Then finally she spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "Something is coming," she said, her words laced with a sense of warning. "I feel it." Jack's instincts kicked into high gear. He didn't know what Iana meant, but the way she spoke made his heart race. He had learned to listen to people who had lived in the wild, and Iana was no exception. She wasn't just talking about the desert or the harshness of the land. She was talking about something else, something more immediate, more dangerous. Without a word, Jack urged Rusty forward, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. His hand instinctively reached for the handle of his revolver, though he knew it was unlikely he would need it unless absolutely necessary. The desert had a way of hiding its dangers until the last moment. "Stay close," he muttered to Ayana, keeping his voice steady. "We'll find shelter soon." But Ayana's hand on his waist tightened again, and Jack could feel her body tensing behind him. She was scared, and that wasn't something Jack saw often. Ayana was a woman who had lived through unimaginable hardship. She had seen and experienced things that would break most people, yet here she was, trembling with unease. "Jack," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "They're coming." Jack's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know who they were, but he didn't need to ask. Ayana's words had the weight of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't just a feeling, she knew. In the distance, a flicker of movement caught Jack's eye. At first, he thought it was just the wind rustling through the desert brush. But then he saw it again, this time closer, dark shapes moving fast and low to the ground. Jack's breath caught in his throat. They weren't alone. "Get ready," he whispered to Ayana. "We've got company." Ayana's grip on his waist tightened even more, and Jack could feel her body press against his back as she leaned in, her face close to his ear. "It's my people," she said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet urgency. "The ones I left behind, they've come for me." Jack's mind raced. The Apache had a reputation for being fierce, and their warriors were known for their skill in the desert. If Ayana's people had come for her, then things were about to get complicated. He had no idea what they wanted, but he knew it wouldn't be good. "Don't do anything rash," Jack warned, his hand now gripping the reins tightly. "We'll handle this, just stay close." Ayana nodded, but her eyes never left the approaching figures in the distance. Jack could see them now, at least 3, maybe more, moving swiftly across the sand, their dark forms barely visible in the night. He couldn't make out their faces, but their movements were fluid and purposeful, like predators closing in on their prey. Jack didn't have much time to think. The night was growing darker, and they were too exposed out in the open. He needed to act fast. He guided Rusty toward a small rise in the sand, hoping it would offer them some cover. The last thing they needed was to be caught out in the open, especially when Jack wasn't sure what kind of reception Ayana's people would give him. As they reached the top of the rise, Jack slowed Rusty to a halt. He turned his head slightly to check on Ayana, her face now pale in the dim light. "Stay quiet," he said, his voice low. "Don't make any noise unless I tell you to." Ayana nodded, her eyes wide with tension. She seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. She had no choice but to trust Jack, and for the first time since they had met, Jack felt the full weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. He wasn't just protecting her from the desert anymore, he was protecting her from her own people. They sat in silence, listening as the wind howled through the desert and the figures continued to approach. Jack's hand hovered over his revolver, but he made no move to draw it. He wasn't sure if he was ready for a fight, but if it came to that, he would have to act quickly. The last thing he wanted was a confrontation with Ayana's people, but he knew it was a possibility. As the shapes drew closer, Jack's eyes narrowed. He could see their outlines more clearly now, and it was clear they weren't alone. Behind them, more figures appeared, shadowy and indistinct in the moonlight. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. It was more than he had expected. There were at least a dozen now, and they were all heading straight for them. Ayana's breath caught, and Jack could feel the tension building between them. She didn't need to tell him what was going to happen next. He knew that her presence here in the desert was a symbol of something larger than just one woman's journey. Her people had found her, and whether they intended to help her or bring her back to the tribe, Jack couldn't say. The sound of hooves grew louder as the riders neared. Jack's grip tightened on the reins, his mind racing for a plan. He couldn't let Ayana get caught in the middle of this. There had to be a way out, but he didn't know if he had the time to think of one. The riders slowed as they approached the rise, their horses coming to a stop just a few yards away. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the leader, a tall man wearing a wide-brimmed hat and dark clothes, his face partially obscured by a scarf. He didn't need to be told who he was. This was Ayana's son, the one she had spoken of, the one who had likely been searching for her all along. Jack didn't know how this would end, but he knew one thing for certain. The journey had just taken a dangerous turn, and they were no longer just fighting the desert. They were fighting for their lives. The tension in the air was thick. Jack's hand hovered near his revolver as he stared at the group of riders before him. The man at the front, who Jack immediately recognized as Ayana's son, sat tall on his horse, his eyes hard as they locked with Jack's. There was no mistaking the look in his gaze. He wasn't here to make friends. Ayana, still sitting behind Jack on Rusty, stiffened. Jack could feel her body tense against his back. She wasn't looking at her son, but her eyes were focused on the group of riders, the emotions swirling behind her quiet demeanor. "Is that him?" Jack whispered to her, his voice low but filled with concern. Ayana nodded slowly. "That's him. His name is Tahoma. He's the leader of a small group of our people who have stayed behind. He's not happy with me." Jack didn't need any more explanation. The hostility in the air was palpable, and he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Ayana's people, her own son among them, had found her. Whether they were here to bring her back or punish her for leaving, Jack couldn't say. But he wasn't about to let anything happen to Ayana, not now. Tahoma spoke first, his voice carrying across the desert night, steady and commanding. "Ayana," he called, his tone colder than the desert air. "You have returned, but you have returned in shame." Ayana remained silent, her gaze still fixed on the ground ahead. She didn't speak, didn't look at her son. Jack could feel the tension building as Tahoma and the other riders shifted on their horses. They were waiting for something, an explanation, an apology, maybe even an excuse for Ayana's departure. But Jack knew one thing: Ayana wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a response. She had made her choices long ago. Jack decided it was time to speak up. He wasn't going to sit there silently while Ayana faced whatever these people had in store for her. He wasn't part of their world, but he was sure of one thing: he wasn't going to let them drag her back without a fight. "Your mother has been through a lot," Jack said, his voice calm but firm, his eyes never leaving Tahoma. "She's made her decisions, and she's not your prisoner. She's been surviving out here just like the rest of us. You've got no right to judge her." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, the silence stretching on before Tahoma responded. His eyes narrowed, and Jack could see the anger in them. But there was something else, too, something that Jack couldn't quite place. It was as if Tahoma wasn't entirely sure what he was supposed to do, what his role was in all of this. "We didn't come here to judge her," Tahoma finally said, his voice quieter now, though still filled with authority. "We came here to bring her home. Our people need her. The land needs her. She cannot keep running away from what is rightfully hers." Ayana shifted behind Jack, her hand lightly touching his shoulder. Jack could feel the weight of her hand, the uncertainty in her touch. She wasn't just worried about herself. She was worried about what this moment meant for everything she had left behind. Jack could sense that the choice wasn't easy for her. She had left everything she knew to survive on her own, but now the world she had tried to escape was right in front of her. The familiar faces, the expectations, the responsibility, it was all crashing down on her. Jack didn't let his eyes leave Tahoma's face. He wasn't about to let this man intimidate him, not while Ayana was vulnerable. "She's not going back with you," Jack said firmly, his voice carrying across the distance. "She's made her choice, and it's hers to make. If you're here to force her, then you'll have to go through me." Tahoma's gaze flickered to Jack, his eyes cold but calculating. For a moment, there was a tense silence, as if both men were sizing each other up. Jack was ready for whatever might come. He knew he wasn't a match for the entire group, but he wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not when Ayana needed him. The other riders shifted on their horses, the sounds of leather and movement in the quiet night. Jack knew they were waiting for their leader's next move, but he wasn't backing down. He had already made his decision, and he wasn't going to let anything happen to Ayana. But then, to Jack's surprise, Tahoma didn't speak. Instead, he sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping slightly. He looked back at the riders as if considering something before turning his gaze back to Ayana. "Ayana," Tahoma said softly, his voice a stark contrast to the harsh tone it had carried moments before. You can't keep running forever. The world we knew is gone, and the people who remain, they need you. They need someone who remembers, who can guide us. Yana's face remained expressionless, but Jack could feel the shift in her body. She was torn, caught between the life she had left behind and the life she had built for herself. She had been strong, surviving on her own in the desert, but now the weight of her past was pulling her back in. You can't just forget everything, Tahoma continued. You were the heart of our people, Ayana. You were the one who carried our traditions, our stories. Without you, we are lost. Jack glanced back at Ayana, noticing the way her hands clenched around his waist. He could see the conflict in her eyes now, the struggle between loyalty to her people and the life she had fought so hard to create for herself. It was a painful choice, one that no one should ever have to make. I'm not the same person I was, Yana whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. I've changed. I can't go back to what we were. I can't lead them. I've seen too much. I've lived too much. I am not the same woman you remember. Jack felt a pang of sympathy for Yana. He could see how much this moment was costing her. She wasn't just being forced to confront her past. She was being asked to choose between who she had been and who she had become. And no one should have to make that choice. The silence stretched on for a few moments before Tahoma spoke again, his voice softer this time. I never wanted you to change, Ayana. I wanted you to come home. But I see now you have changed, and maybe that's something I can't control. But don't turn your back on us completely. We need you, Ayana. Even if you can't lead us, you can still help us. Yana didn't respond immediately. Instead, she sat quietly behind Jack, her eyes fixed on the ground. Jack could feel the weight of her decision pressing down on her. He had no idea what she was going to choose, but he knew one thing: whatever happened, he would be by her side. After a long moment, Ayana finally spoke, her voice steady and calm. I can't go back, Tahoma. I can't live in the past, but I'll help you in any way I can. I'll share what I know. I'll help you survive, but I won't return to that life. I can't. Jack felt a sense of relief wash over him. Yana had made her choice. It wasn't an easy one, but it was her decision. And in that moment, Jack knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The desert, the dangers, and the people from her past, they could all come for her. But Jack would always be there, standing by her side, ready to protect her, no matter what. The following days were filled with uncertainty and quiet tension. Jack and Ayana had made their decision, but the consequences of that choice were far from clear. The group of Apache riders, including Tahoma, had left them be, for now. They had not taken Ayana by force, but Jack knew it was only a matter of time before they would return, perhaps with more urgency. He was prepared for anything, but deep down he hoped things wouldn't come to that. He wanted peace, for Ayana's sake and his own. After the confrontation, Ayana had become more withdrawn, her thoughts distant. She would sit by the fire, her eyes lost in the flames, as though she was seeking answers that she couldn't find. Jack respected her silence, not wanting to push her. He knew that her past was complicated, filled with the memories of a life that was no longer hers. She had chosen to leave, to survive on her own, and now those choices were confronting her once again. As the days passed, Jack and Ayana continued to travel through the desert. Their journey took them further from the mountains, deeper into the barren stretch of land that Jack had come to know so well. The desert had a way of making everything feel both vast and small at the same time. The horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, and yet in the silence of it all, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of closeness with Ayana. It was as if the desert, in all its emptiness, had brought them together in a way that nothing else could have. Though Ayana had been quiet, Jack noticed small things, glances, a shift in her posture, the way her fingers moved when she thought he wasn't looking. He could sense her inner conflict, the weight of everything she had left behind and everything she had yet to face. He had no answers for her, but he could offer her something the desert didn't: his presence. That, he hoped, would be enough. One afternoon, as they rode through the desert, Ayana spoke, her voice soft but steady. Jack, she said, her tone carrying more emotion than he had heard in days. I've been thinking. Jack glanced back at her, his heart lifting at the sound of her voice. What about? He asked gently. Ayana hesitated before answering. About what Tahoma said about needing me. About our people needing me. She paused, taking in a deep breath. I don't know what to do. I can't go back to them, Jack. I can't go back to the life I had, not after everything I've seen. But her voice trailed off as though the words were too heavy to speak. Jack slowed Rusty to a stop, the soft sound of hooves on sand the only noise breaking the silence. He turned to face Ayanna, his expression serious. He wanted to say something reassuring, but words never seemed to come out right when it mattered most. Instead, he simply nodded, showing her he was listening, that he understood the depth of her struggle. "Maybe I can't go back," Ayanna continued, her eyes gazing out into the vastness of the desert. "But I've spent so much of my life running. From the past, from what I was supposed to be. And now, I'm afraid that if I don't go back, if I don't help them, I'll lose a part of myself forever." Jack stayed silent, knowing that whatever he said would not make her decision any easier. But he could offer her one thing, his understanding. He had lived his life in a way that many would call simple, riding the open range, tending cattle, and avoiding the complexities of the world around him. But his journey with Ayanna had shown him something deeper. The world wasn't simple, people weren't simple, and neither was Ayanna's past. She had a connection to something much larger than just the land, and it weighed heavily on her. "I don't know what the right answer is for you," Jack said quietly. "But I do know one thing, you don't have to carry this alone." Yana met his gaze, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to gauge whether he truly understood. For a moment, she said nothing. And then, almost as if the words had been waiting to escape, she spoke again. "I thought I could leave it all behind," she said softly. "But it's not that simple. It's not just about the land or the people. It's about who I am, Jack. And if I leave all that behind, if I walk away, then I'll never be the same. I'll lose myself. I won't know who I am anymore." Jack nodded slowly, his thoughts turning inward. He couldn't imagine the weight Ayanna was carrying, the loss of her people, the struggles of trying to live as an outsider, the constant battle between the life she had known and the one she was trying to build for herself. It was no easy choice. But what Jack knew was this: Ayanna wasn't just trying to figure out what was right for her people, she was trying to figure out what was right for herself. "I know you're scared," Jack said, his voice steady, "but you don't have to have all the answers right now. You can take it one step at a time. You can choose what feels right even if it's hard. And no matter what you decide, I'll be here. You don't have to make this choice alone." For the first time in days, Ayanna smiled, a small, bittersweet smile that barely touched her lips. But it was enough. Jack could see the relief in her eyes, the quiet peace that she hadn't had in so long. The path ahead was still unclear, but at least she wasn't facing it by herself anymore. That evening, as the sun set behind them, casting a warm orange glow over the desert, Jack and Ayanna made camp. The fire crackled as they sat side by side, the crackling of the flames filling the silence between them. They didn't speak much that night, but there was something comforting in their shared silence. Ayanna's presence was steady now, her anxiety somewhat eased by the choice she had made to lean on Jack, to trust in his support. The weight of the past still loomed over her, but for that moment she allowed herself to let it go. As they sat under the stars, the desert stretching out before them, Jack couldn't help but think about how far they had come. What had started as a chance encounter in the desert had become something more, something neither of them had expected. He had helped Ayanna because she had needed it, but now he realized that it was more than just a simple act of kindness. It had been a journey for both of them. In the days that followed, Jack and Ayanna continued on their path, moving deeper into the desert, but their bond was stronger than ever. The uncertainty was still there, as it always would be, but Jack had no doubt that whatever came next, they would face it together. And for the first time in a long while, Ayanna felt like she had a place, a purpose, perhaps not with her people, but with Jack. And that, for now, was enough. As they moved forward, Jack knew they had both found something they hadn't expected in the harsh, unforgiving desert. In each other, they had found strength, understanding, and the courage to face whatever the future might bring. And that was a reward far more valuable than anything either of them had ever imagined.